even if you don't buy our book, that you'll buy a book from Mrs. Dalloway's, and maybe more than one, and maybe more than just tonight as well. The way that we've been doing this, Jen and I only met for the first time yesterday, but we have since done approximately 197 presentations together. And we have it down to a science. I talk for a bit, Jen talks for a bit, and then we take some questions from you folks, and then we render all of your books non-returnable. And so that's how we're going to proceed. But before we do, I do want to mention that I have another book coming out. I only just saw it in the flesh today, as it were, called Information Doesn't Want to Be Free, from San Francisco's McSweeney's Publishing. It's a book about writing, publishing, copyright, and life in the 21st century. And it has introductions by Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer. And I'll be back next week to present it at the JCC in San Francisco, and where you will be able to buy it, because you can't buy this because it's the only copy and it's mine. But you can see it when you come up. So I'm a science fiction writer, and being a science fiction writer is weird, and people don't know what to say when you tell them that you're a science fiction writer. It's sort of like someone asks you what you do, and you announce with a perfectly straight face that you paint the stripes on the bees, or keep the maintenance regime up on the Tooth Fairy's wand. And no one really knows what to say when you say it, and they kind of fum-fa, and then they usually say something like, huh, science fiction writer. That must be hard, because like you predict the future and then it doesn't come true. And I understand where they're coming from on that one, but it drives me crazy, because science fiction writers don't and never have predicted the future, although a lot of science fiction writers have been self-deluded enough to think that they could predict the future. But if you ganged up all the predictions ever made by science fiction since the days of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, I think you'd find that almost none of the predictions came true. I mean, some of them did, but to single those out and then laud science fiction as a predictive literature is like firing a shotgun into the side of a barn, drawing a bullseye around the place where the pellets clustered, and declaring yourself an excellent marksman. But that doesn't mean that science fiction doesn't have a relationship with the future. Clearly it does. I think science fiction does two really important things in relation to the future. The first one is that it inspires it. So when Gene Roddenberry came up with the flip-open communicators for the Star Trek dudes to carry, he inspired a generation of engineers, including the Motorola engineers who created the Motorola flip phone 20 years later. It's really clear that Gene Roddenberry didn't have a crystal ball into which he could see Motorola engineers later making this phone. Rather, Motorola engineers, when grasping around for design that would kind of reek of futurism, latched onto this beloved design that now feels so antiquated and old school, and so on. And you know, inspiring is better than predicting any day, because predicting implies that the future is coming no matter what we do. If it's predictable, it's foreordained. And if that's the case, why bother getting out of bed? Whereas inspiring, well, that's wonderful, right? It means that you can act on the world and change it and make it a better place. There's another thing that that science fiction does that's related to the future that's even more important, and that's that it can help us understand the present. And the present is the moment at which the past becomes the future. And the present is a particularly difficult moment to understand, because we don't have the benefit of hindsight yet to figure out what actually matters about what's going on today. Our effects are so diffused today that it's really hard to make sense of it. You know, Mimi Ito, who some of you will know her work, she's this preeminent scholar of how young people use networks. She runs the MacArthur Digital Youth Project at UC Irvine, whose work is all Creative Commons licensed, and I urge you to download it and read it, especially if you know kids who use the internet and you have questions about how it affects them, because it's the best work on this ever done. And she says, you know, she goes around and gives talks, and what everyone wants to know is, what do iPads do to kids' brains? And it's really clear that everything you do does something to your brain, because that's what you think with. And so if you are thinking, something is happening to your brain. But that includes thinking about brushing your teeth, or thinking about whether or not the 7 castaways on Gilligan's Island really mapped to the 7 deadly sins, or you know, thinking about whether or not the bus comes at 1/4 past the hour, 20 past the hour. All of those things are quote unquote rewiring your brain. And she says, you know, if we wait 10 years and then do big broad studies, we could probably tell you what iPads did to kids' brains. But the one thing you can be pretty sure of in 10 years is that there won't be iPads. Right? They will be distant memory, as distant as the flip phone. And so if we want to know what the future is going to be, we have to be able to diagnose the present in real time. We have to be able to make sense of it as it's happening. And this is something that I think science fiction is particularly good at. I think in the same way that if you go to the doctor and you say, I have a sore throat, and she swabs your throat and rubs it on a petri dish and leaves it over the weekend, and then comes back and looks at it under a microscope, she can tell you really important things about your body, not because she's made an accurate model of your body, but because she made a very specifically inaccurate model of your body, where only one fact about you is the totalizing fact of this little thought experiment world. A science fiction writer can reach into the world and pluck out a single technology and build a thought experiment world where that technology is the total fact of it. Not because that world is coming, but because flying through that world, like someone flying through an architect's rendering of a building, will give you a sense of what the lived experience of that technology might be in a way that nothing else can. It's why if in 1947 someone said, well, we've got this peace dividend, why don't we use it to put cameras everywhere so we can catch all the bad guys? It would have been really hard to explain what was wrong with it except by saying, that just sounds creepy to me. But by 1948, when Orwell's 1984 come out, you could say that's Orwellian. And you could import the whole narrative of what the lived experience is of life under surveillance, because Orwell gave us a tool for tracting the present. And so it's a tool that has helped us make a future, and it has served us in rather good stead. Which brings me to In Real Life, which started out as a short story called Anda's Game that I wrote after an article on a website called Slashdot appeared, saying that someone had come to the Game Developers Conference here at the Moscone Center and said that in the massively multiplayer game of the day, which was called EverQuest, there was a core mechanic which was doing boring things a lot, just like Warcraft. You would have to kill boring monsters a lot, like really low-level monsters. You would have to craft low-level activities a lot in order to build up the gold and experience points to get to the exciting stuff. And he said that he'd hired a factory full of Mexican workers on the US border whom he could pay pennies per hour to play EverQuest all day to make these goods that he could then sell on eBay to bored rich people. And this caused a stir for two reasons. One was the guy had a reputation for being a pathological liar, so no one was sure if he was telling the truth. But the other one was that it was weird, right? It was a weird form of cheating that no one had ever thought of. So I wrote this story, Anda's Game, that Salon published, about a young girl who finds herself playing in an all-girl guild in a virtual world that has been formed explicitly to help young women have a safe space that's free from sexual harassment and misogyny and sexism and bullying, and who finds herself first involved in killing gold farmers and then in finding common cause with them and realizing that all struggles for justice are linked. And she ends up getting together with union organizers who are involved in organizing trade unions of gold farmers. And at the time, as today, my novels are published by Tor Books, which is part of Macmillan. And they're in Manhattan, and every time I visit them, I go down 2 floors to First Second, which is the graphic novel imprint at Macmillan, who do great comics. And I would go down there to catch free comics before I left. And they would always ask if I was ever going to do a comic. And I did this pitch for a big, long, multi-volume comic based on Anda's Game called For the Win, where each book would be set in a different country and a different virtual world, which they hated. So I wrote a novel based on it instead. But in the process of reading that pitch, they went back and read the short story, and they said, this is great. We should see if we can do that. And so this is how we came to do the graphic novel, which Jen will talk about in more detail. But I think that the graphic novel has become that story is a good story for using for dissecting the present, if not for predicting the future. Although, as the years have gone by and more people have gotten involved in gold farming, there have been regular stories in the press about gold farming. And so whenever those appear, I always get emails from people going, oh, you're so prescient. I didn't think that this was real, but clearly you predicted it. And this is predicting the present. It's the cheapest trick science fiction writers have up their sleeves. But what we have now in a world where there are 400,000 people who gold farm is more and more people whose labor looks like gold farming, where they're doing small repetitive tasks for bored rich people who don't want to have to do the task themselves without any job security, sometimes against the rules of the place where they're doing the task, and so they have especially precarious positions. and they work through services like the Mechanical Turk and Fiverr and TaskRabbit. And not only does the labor market look a lot like gold farming, but so does the politics look a lot like the politics of a game. So games have really curious politics. They call themselves worlds, and they sometimes call the people who play them citizens. The citizens usually get a constitution, right? We the people. And when you play a game, what you get is a long user license agreement that doesn't say anything like we the people. It says, by being dumb enough to use this service, you agree that we're allowed to come over to your house and punch your grandmother and make long distance calls and wear your underwear and eat all the food in your fridge. And it's more like we the suckers. And we the sucker is the model for all of these services where you don't get to own the stuff that you think you own, you only get to license it. Whether that's your iPhone, whose software you can only install if the Politburo in Cupertino thinks that it doesn't disrupt their business model too much, or Facebook, or console game, or these days your thermostat, all regulated by this kind of weird paternalistic regime. These are devices whose characteristics you're not allowed to know in detail, let alone modify, because you might open them up so you could do something that you're not supposed to do, which is a hell of a collision course to be on in a world that is increasingly made of computers, where our houses are just giant computer case mods that we live in, where you take the computers out of them and the house becomes uninhabitable almost immediately, where our car is a computer that rolls down the road at 80 miles an hour with us trapped in it, and we've seen attacks on the Bluetooth systems, or through the Bluetooth systems on those cars that can disable the steering and the brakes, where a 747 is a flying Solaris workstation in a fancy aluminum case connected to some really badly secured SCADA controllers. Our bodies are in computers all day long, and increasingly our computers are inside our bodies. Whether that's because you grew up with the Walkman or the iPod, and you've logged enough punishing earbud hours that if you're not killed by a self-driving car first, you're going to need a hearing aid, and that hearing aid is really unlikely to be a beige, retro, hipster, analog, transistorized hearing aid. It's going to be a computer that lives inside your body, that knows what you hear, that can tell other people what you hear, that can make you hear things that aren't there, and that can make you not hear things that are there, all depending on how it's regulated. And the way it's regulated these days, you don't get to own it. And this isn't science fiction, it's science fact. You know, I travel all the time, and the first rule of the traveler is ABC, always be charging, because your laptop is your lifeline, and there is no Moore's law for batteries. And so whenever I get to an airport lounge, the first thing I do is scan the baseboards and look for a plug. So I'm sitting in an airport lounge one day, all plugged in, and a guy comes in and says, "Can I use that plug?" And I say, "Dude, I'm charging my laptop before the flight." And he rolls his pants leg up to the knee to show me his robotic prosthesis. And he said, "I have to charge my leg before the flight." So, people ask me when I talk about this stuff whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about it. But to be an optimist or a pessimist is to be a predictor. It's to believe that there's an outcome that's coming that we don't really have any look into. So I'm not an optimist or a pessimist. If the future was knowable, there'd be no point in getting out of bed. I don't have optimism, but I have hope, which I think is more important than optimism. Hope is why you tread water after the ship has sunk in open sea. Not because you have any reasonable expectation of being picked up, but because everyone who has ever picked up treaded water until they were. And it's why you tread water twice as hard if you're holding up someone else who can't kick for themselves. So I have hope, because the world is full of people and things that matter to me. As the tick said, "Don't destroy the world, it's where I keep all my stuff." And because I have hope, I want you to have hope too. I want you to think about not buying our books, although that's nice, and not just supporting the store, although that's nice too. I want you to think about how you can help seize the means of information and make a future where the computers listen to us, where their default posture is "yes, master," and not "I can't let you do that, Dave," because we know how that movie ends. There are organizations that have fought for many years to keep computers open and free and secure, and those organizations are doing better work than ever. Some of them are headquartered here in the Bay Area, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Some of them are based in New York or Washington, D.C., like the American Civil Liberties Union and Public Knowledge. Some are in Boston, like Fight for the Future and Demand Progress. But all over the world, there are organizations that are working to make our networks and our devices answer to us and be tools of liberation instead of tools of oppression. And I hope that even if you can't bring yourself to give up your Netflix, who inveigled the W3C into adding digital rights management to the entire web, even if you can't bring yourself to give up your Comcast, who are destroying net neutrality, even if you can't bring yourself to give up your fruit-flavored device, who from the company that made DRM the alpha and omega of how we interact with our computers, that you'll think about spending half the money that you spend on those, or a quarter of the money that you spend on those, on fighting for laws that ensure that those companies can't destroy our information ecology, the nervous system of the 21st century. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jen. Thank you.
Thank you, Cory. Okay, so I'm Jen Wang. I'm the co-author and illustrator of In Real Life, the book that's an adaptation of Cory's short story Anna's Game. And just out of curiosity, how many people have read Anna's Game? Maybe a couple people? Oh, actually, a lot of people. Okay, so yeah, a couple years ago, I did this book called Cocoa Be Good. It was my first graphic novel, and it was published by First Second. Which is owned by Macmillan, and they, a couple years or sometime after Cocoa Be Good was released, they asked if I was familiar with Cory Doctorow and if I'd ever read any of his work and if I'd be interested in working on this adaptation of Anna's Game. And actually, I was only aware of Cory's work as like a blogger and internet activist. He had actually written up this really glowing review for Cocoa Be Good when it had come out, and that was really special because it was my first book, and you know, to have something sort of pointed out on Boing Boing was this like really great feeling, and I remember being very honored that he'd written about it. So I was aware of his of Boing Boing and kind of like what he did online, and I hadn't read any of his young adult fiction, and so they sent me the link for Anna's Game, and I read it, and I felt like it was not what I expected because they, I was told that this was going to be like a young adult adaptation, and there was this like very simple story on the surface about like a young teenage girl who is a gamer and goes online and sort of meets these other people, these other friends who end up introducing her to this whole other world about gold farming. And but then, obviously that's not a very typical story. There's there's a lot of kind of economics and stuff that, like kind of politics. And I just thought there was like a really that was a good place to sort of build on that because they wanted an adaptation that was like different. It was going to be visual, and there was going to have to be some updates because this has been about like 10 years since Anna's Game came out, and since then World of Warcraft was released, which obviously changed a lot in MMORPGs. It sort of expanded. Like so many more people started playing those games because it was so big and so accessible, and obviously because of that, gold farming really, blew up too. So one of the first things I think I did in the adaptation to change it was like my first draft was actually really, really close to the short story, including the fact that it took place in London, which is where Cory lives. And so I kind of took parts of the short story like pretty much verbatim, and then I would sort of add like a scene or two, and they would be so different because I would be writing in my kind of very California style, like American speak. And so the first draft, I think when we sent it to Cory, he was like, "Are these people like English or are they American?" And I was like, "Oh no, like it's too obvious." So so the first thing I changed was I made the protagonist American, and because there was going to be in the short story, she befriends this girl Lucy who is from America when she's from London, and in the newer version, I made it so that Anna's from Arizona and her friend Lucy is from New York. So you have this like clear geographical and cultural divide there. That's still very that's very clear, I guess, when you read it. So that was like the first draft, or like the first and second draft or so, and progressively, we, like I would write a draft and send it to Cory, and he would like make little notes, kind of add some of his ideas I would bounce off of, and we also set it in China now, which in the original short story it took place in Mexico, but obviously China is where most of goat farming takes place, and also because it was a little more, I thought it was a lot more complex, because then you have this whole other like kind of level of like the West versus China like tension going on. And so after we did that, I also made one of the main characters in the story, who was previously a labor organizer, a union organizer, into a teenage boy, actually, a teenage boy goat farmer, because I felt like it would be more intimate, I guess, if Anda would make friends with someone who was her age, and who was actually the thing that we're all talking about in the book. This way, she would have a very direct connection to it and would feel more compelled to act upon these new discoveries. And so that was, I ended up not reading For the Wind, because I felt like I might end up taking too many influences. So, but we ended up doing a lot of the same research. We read a lot of the same books. We mentioned, we were both talking yesterday about someone called Leslie Chang wrote a book called Factory Girls. And it's all about sort of these like modern, or these contemporary women who are working in China, in Shenzhen, and sort of about because they're migrant workers, sort of how they move from the country to the city, and the big changes that have to kind of occur, and just like the whole life, how it's very, there's not a whole lot of opportunity, so you have to be very clever, you have to be very strong, and just like how hard it is, but also how brave these people are. So in that, I took a lot of inspiration from that in writing the Raymond character, who's the gold farmer character in real life. So eventually we got a script that we were fairly happy with, and I started drawing. And actually, my first pass through the drawing, I got to about like 100 pages or so, and then I was feeling really bad. Like something about it wasn't working. And because drawing takes so much longer, it took, like about a year or so, I just got this weird sinking feeling of like, at first I thought maybe I was just over cartooning, like I wasn't interested in drawing anymore. But then I figured out that the reason I was feeling bad was because something was not working in the comic, and if I kept going, I could like preemptively feel this like shame of seeing the book on the shelf and not being at its best. So this was already like, it was like due pretty soon, so I emailed my editor and asked if he would be okay if I redrew the book. Maybe saving, like a couple of the early pages, because those I could probably just like switch out some dialogue. And I wrote this long email like giving all the reasons and like where I wanted to change things. And happily he said yes. He agreed that like, this was like worth redoing if I thought I could do this on time, since we had a deadline. So I ended up rewriting this draft one last time over like a Christmas break, I think, and spent the next year just like, doing it as fast as I can. I penciled, inked, and colored, within like 9 months or so. And I got it in like when we should have had it done, which before it would have just been a more leisurely track for me, but I just ended up squeezing it all. But the good thing about that is I know I can do a comic book in like less than a year now, so that's awesome, and I can do it forever. So then I delivered the book, and I think we both ended up pretty happy with it. And it turns out actually that even though I mentioned earlier that Cory had written the review for Coco, my first book, he didn't attach my name to that, so he didn't remember that it was me. And when I delivered the book, he read the back jacket and was like, oh wait, like you did that book I liked. So that was pretty fun, because otherwise I would have felt like way more pressure to like try to like, I don't know, like do do a better job or something. And the whole time I was like, oh, he likes my stuff already, so it's probably okay. Yeah, so that's how in real life came to be.
So for the questions, we've been alternating genders, and we can start either way, but if that's okay with you folks, it's been working great. Anyone like to start? You can go straight to the signing if you'd like. It's because people in the Bay Area are such conformists and milquetoasts, and they never have any questions, and they're not the sort of people who are engaged in the spirit of intellectual inquiry, clearly not like Angelinos, who had so many questions. Go ahead.
I don't really know a ton about what the real guts of the backbone of the internet are, but imagine the current internet is just kind of monopolized by 3 companies, and we all have to pay these kind of outrageous weird censorship, like all that kind of freaky stuff. How hard do you think it would be to just establish an alternate internet? Like, would that be possible without a lot of public infrastructure? Or,
so the question is, what would it take to disestablish a totally concentrated internet where there were just a few companies that were kind of running everything? And I think that what you're describing is not just a code layer. Larry Lessig, he talks about the 4 forces that regulate the world. There's code, law, norms, and markets. And I think what you just described is not just like a technological infrastructure where a few companies own the technology. It's also political infrastructure where a few companies are allowed to own the technology, and it's also a market infrastructure where a few companies are profiting and have all this windfall profits from owning all the technology and can use it to corrupt the political process. And it's even normative, right? Assuming that people are like, well, like AT&T, well, they take care of us. They're kind of paternalistic, and everybody knows that they're, we have Lily Tomlin making fun of the operator on the TV. We're the phone company. We don't have to care. But still, what else who else is going to run it? Fred's phone company. Who wants Fred's phone company? We need Ma Bell taking care of us. So you just described a world where like those 4 factors presumably are all working together, because it's hard to imagine that kind of concentration without all of that stuff. And so for me, I'm inclined to think of what you've just described as something that's like an epiphenomenon or outgrowth of corruption, what Larry Lessig calls corruption. And I think that we fight corruption with our networks, like the way that we can fight back against the fact that Congress answers almost exclusively to funders, and that's not just rhetorical. Like, there's good scholarly work that shows where there's a congressional issue that splits on the constituents' interests or the funders' interests, that something like 90% of the policy outcomes in the last 20 years have gone to funders' interests instead of constituent interests. So if Congress is almost exclusively answerable to its funders, then the only way we're going to fight that is by like having big distributed networks through which we can organize boycotts and fundraising and get out the vote efforts and all those other things. But and so in one sense, that I think it'd be very hard, not because it'd be hard to like get the switches in place, but because it would be hard to get the politicians to let us get the switches in place. So I think that situation's pretty nightmarish. That's a pretty dreadful place to be. And I grew up as an activist in the 80s, spending 98% of my time stuffing envelopes and writing addresses on them and putting stamps on them, and 2% of the time figuring out what went in the envelopes. And the internet's given us all that stuff for free. And I think we forget just how much we get out of the internet for organizing ourselves to do things together. And doing things together, it's literally superhuman, right? It's more than one person can do. So to lose our superpower, to lose the power of being able to work together without tithing most of our time to something boring like stuffing envelopes, that would be a huge crisis and a tragedy. Are there any women with questions in the audience? Go ahead.
I'm curious, in your research about gold farming, if you found anything actually going on in terms of trying to organize those people or try to get conditions better for them, if that's still happening?
I didn't. It was more analogy for me, or parable, than reality. But what there is an independent trade union movement and an anti-corruption movement in China, and especially these days we've seen in Hong Kong. And watching what's happened in Hong Kong has been amazing. I kept watching the news and thinking, you know, if I wrote this scene, I'd be accused of self-parody. So it's very heartening. Jen, did you see anything?
Yeah, pretty much what you just said. I didn't really see anything like that about gold farming specifically. Although not that this is really the same thing, but Cory mentioned, I think yesterday, that like he found some gold farmer zines, which I'm like really excited to read at some point, because I'm actually really curious to see what they wrote about, if they talked about work or if they talked about games.
Remind me of adding them too. Young man back there, yeah.
So this is something that personally I noticed as I read a lot of your books, that specifically a difference between your books set in the present, or what could be the present, and books set in the future. In the present, and like For the Win, Little Brother, overall and at the end of the books, there's kind of a human purpose, and there's unity, there's people working together for a greater good. But then books set in the future, like Makers and Down and Out of the Magic Kingdom, there just kind of seems to be an apathy or a sort of narcissism that the protagonists have. And I was just wondering if that's something that you feel that the present is tending towards, or that's just something that came out that way in those books.
That's incredibly insightful. I've never thought of that. I wonder why I do that, because it's true. Well, you know, because the young adult novels, they don't... I had a huge argument with my editor and my agent about Little Brother, my first young adult novel, because they wanted Marcus to, quote, win. And I was like, he's 17 years old, right? He's not gonna restore the Bill of Rights to America single-handedly. He committed a whole ton of crimes. He's gonna get arrested, right? The judge doesn't look at 17-year-olds and say, well, I guess it was just high spirits, right? I mean, this is a country where, with the highest rate of incarceration of any in the world, 97% of the people who are indicted are convicted, right? I mean, this is, so it just seemed unlikely. And so Marcus's victory, for all that it's a victory, and it ends with that unity of purpose you just described, Marcus doesn't win, right? I mean, yeah, he gets the DHS out of San Francisco, but he also goes to jail, and he also ends up in a halfway house, and he also ends up